The summer of 1,944 inches. Normandy was a season of dust, flies, and the sickening, sweet smell of unburied death. For the infantrymen of the 1st Canadian Army, the romantic notion of liberating Europe had long since been replaced by a grim, survivalist reality. The war had become a math problem, and for the Canadian soldier, the equation was broken. The problem was simple. The German defense doctrine was superior to the Allied method of attack. The Germans, masters of the defensive battle, had turned the rolling wheat fields and thick hedgerows south of Caen into a layered fortress. They had dug deep. They had positioned their MG-42 machine guns to create interlocking zones of death that could scythe down a platoon in seconds. They had zeroed their mortars on every crossroads and every depression in the ground. And the Canadians? They were walking. It is a strange and terrifying thing to consider that by 1944, despite all the technological advancements of the 20th century, the radar, the heavy bombers, the proximity fuses, the basic experience of the infantryman hadn't changed much since the Roman legions. To take ground, a man had to stand up, expose his soft, vulnerable body to the air, and walk towards the enemy. He had a shirt of khaki wool and a helmet that could barely stop a piece of shrapnel, let alone a high-velocity bullet. He was a soft target in a world of hard steel. The German defenders knew this. In fact, they counted on it. Sitting in their reinforced bunkers, the veterans of the 12th SS Panzer Division and the Wehrmacht regular infantry watched the Canadians with a mixture of professional respect and tactical disdain. They knew the Allied routine. First would come the artillery, the drum fire that forced everyone underground. It was terrifying, yes, but once the shelling stopped, the Germans knew they had a window. They knew the Canadian infantry would be walking across the open ground behind the barrage. It took time to walk 1,000 yards in muddy boots. It gave the German gunners time to shake off the concussion, man their weapons, and wait. To the German tank commanders peering through their periscopes, the Canadian attacks often looked like suicide. They would see the lines of men struggling through the wheat, accompanied perhaps by a few Sherman tanks. The Shermans were dangerous, but they could be dealt with by the Tigers and Panthers. The infantry, however, were just targets. The Germans would wait until the Canadians were out in the open, in the killing zone, and then they would open fire. The result was always the same. The attack would stall, the men would dive for cover, and the stretcher bearers would have a busy night. The Germans mocked the Allied reliance on flesh and blood. They laughed at the inefficiency of it. They called the Sherman tanks Ronsons because they lit up so easily, and they viewed the infantry as sheep being herded to the slaughter. They felt secure in their technological superiority. They believed that as long as the Canadians had to walk to the fight, the German defensive line would hold forever. But the Germans had forgotten one thing. The Canadian Army was not a rigid, aristocratic institution like the British. Nor was it a mass-produced industrial machine like the Americans. It was a strange hybrid, populated by miners, farmers, and mechanics men who were used to fixing things with baling wire and ingenuity. And commanding the Canadian Corps was a man who treated warfare not as a tradition, but as an engineering problem. His name was Lieutenant General Guy Simonds. Simonds was cold, aloof, and arguably the most brilliant tactical mind Canada produced in the war. He looked at the casualty lists from July. He looked at the disaster of Verrières Ridge, where the Black Watch had been massacred crossing open ground. He realized that the walking equation was unsolvable. If his men continued to walk into battle, they would continue to die. He needed a way to get them through the zone of death, that terrified last 200 yards, where the machine guns did their work without getting hit. He needed an armored bus, but such a thing didn't exist. The Americans had half-tracks, but they were open-topped and had thin armor that could be pierced by heavy machine gun fire. They were also in short supply. Simonds didn't have time to wait for a new invention from the factories in Detroit or Birmingham. He had an attack to launch in a week. Operation Totalize was scheduled for early August, and it required the Canadians to break the stalemate and drive south to Falaise. Simonds looked around his motor pool for a solution. His eyes landed on the Priest. The M7 Priest was an American-made self-propelled gun, essentially a 105mm artillery piece mounted on a Sherman tank chassis. The Canadians had hundreds of them, but they were being phased out. The barrel wear was becoming an issue, and the regiments were swapping them for the British 25-pounder towed guns. These priests were sitting in supply depots, destined for the scrap heap or rear echelon duty. Simonds saw something else. He saw a tank chassis that was mechanically sound. He saw thick, sloping frontal armor that could stop a Panzerfaust or a 20mm cannon shell. He saw an engine that could keep pace with the armored columns. He issued an order that baffled his maintenance crews. Take the guns out. It sounded insane. A tank without a gun is just a tractor. It's a heavy, useless lump of steel. But the order was specific. Simonds wanted the 105mm howitzers removed. He wanted the internal ammunition racks ripped out. He wanted the front aperture, the hole where the gun used to stick out, plated over with whatever scrap steel they could find. The rumors started flying through the Canadian workshops. The general has lost it, the mechanics muttered as they fired up their welding torches. He wants us to build headless tanks. The result was one of the ugliest vehicles of the Second World War. Without the main gun, the vehicle looked truncated, like a bulldog with its nose cut off. It was a hollow steel box on tracks. The mechanics welded surplus armor plates over the gun port, often doing a rough, hasty job because time was short. They welded strips of metal to the sides to act as steps. They threw sandbags on the floor to dampen the mine blasts. They called them Kangaroos. The idea was simple. The infantry was the baby in the pouch. The vehicle would carry 12 to 15 fully equipped soldiers deep into enemy territory, protected by the same armor as a main battle tank. When the infantrymen of the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders and the North Shore Regiment first saw them, they were skeptical. They walked around these defrocked priests, kicking the tracks. They looked weird. They looked broken. A tank without a gun felt like a neutered dog. It felt defenseless. "You want us to ride in that?" a sergeant asked. "What do we do if we run into a tiger, throw rocks at it?" But then they climbed inside. For the first time in the war, they weren't exposed. They crouched down in the belly of the beast, surrounded by inches of comforting steel. They realized that for the first time, they wouldn't have to listen to the ping and zip of sniper bullets whizzing past their ears. They wouldn't have to dive into the mud every time a mortar round landed 50 yards away. They were safe. The Germans, meanwhile, had no idea what was happening in the Canadian rear. Their reconnaissance aircraft were grounded by Allied air superiority. Their spies were unable to penetrate the lines. They saw only the usual buildup of supplies. They assumed the coming attack would follow the standard British doctrine: artillery, then walking infantry, then tanks. They prepared their kill zones accordingly. They oiled their machine guns. They checked their range cards. They were ready to laugh at the Tommies, trudging through the wheat one more time. But Simonds had one more trick up his sleeve. He wasn't just going to use strange vehicles. He was going to use them in a strange way. He decided to launch the attack at night. Night attacks with armor were considered impossible in 1944. Tanks are blind in the day. At night, they are helpless. Drivers can't see ditches. Commanders can't see landmarks. To solve this, Simonds employed artificial moonlight. He ordered giant searchlights to be positioned in the rear, shining their beams off the low cloud deck. The reflected light would cast a ghostly, dim glow over the battlefield, enough for the drivers to see the ground, but dim enough to confuse the German gunners. He also used Bofor's anti-aircraft guns, firing tracer rounds horizontally over the heads of the attacking columns to act as directional guides. On the night of August 7th, 1944, the stage was set for one of the weirdest and most terrifying spectacles of the war. On the German side of the line, near the village of Tilly-la-Campagne, the sentries of the 89th Infantry Division were peering into the gloom. It was just before midnight. The air was cool. They heard the familiar rumble of engines in the distance, but it sounded different this time. It wasn't the stop-start grinding of tanks maneuvering into firing positions. It was a steady, low roar, like a dam breaking. Then, the moonlight switched on. The clouds above them began to glow with an eerie silver luminescence. Shadows stretched long and distorted across the fields. And then, the ground began to shake. The German defenders rushed to their positions. "Tanks!" The cry went up. They manned their anti-tank guns. They peered through their optics, trying to find a silhouette to target. What they saw emerging from the artificial fog didn't make sense. They saw columns of vehicles, moving four abreast, packed tightly together. They looked like tanks, but they had no turrets. They had no long barrels protruding from the front. To the confused German eyes, they looked like headless monsters, hulking shapes of steel that were charging forward with a reckless, suicidal speed. The German machine gunners opened fire. This was the moment they usually won. This was the moment the infantry would drop and the attack would stall. The MG-42S ripped into the columns. Thousands of rounds of 7.92mm ammunition hammered the advancing shapes. But nothing stopped. The bullets sparked harmlessly off the frontal armor of the Kangaroos. The sparks danced like fireflies in the gloom. The vehicles didn't slow down. They didn't deploy infantry. They just kept coming. Confusion began to ripple through the German trenches. "Why aren't they stopping?" a loader screamed. "Why aren't they shooting back?" These headless tanks were ignoring the rules of engagement. They were driving straight through the artillery barrages, ignoring the shrapnel that would have shredded a walking man. They were driving straight through the machine gun fire. They were driving straight at the German trenches. The German tank commanders and their Panthers and Tigers were equally baffled. They tried to target the columns, but the dust kicked up by hundreds of tracks, combined with the eerie shifting shadows of the artificial moonlight, made aiming impossible. The Canadian columns were moving too fast. They weren't stopping to duel. They were bypassing the strong points. The laughter that usually accompanied a defensive victory died in the throats of the German soldiers. This wasn't a battle, it was a stampede. And the stampede was heading right for them. The lead Kangaroo, commanded by a Canadian sergeant who was peering out of the hatch with grit in his teeth, revved its engine. He saw the German trench line ahead, the same trench line that had held them up for weeks. The machine gun nest in front of him was firing continuously, the tracers hammering his hull. "Hold on back there!" he yelled to the infantry in the belly of the priest. He didn't swerve. He slammed his foot on the accelerator. The 25-ton steel beast surged forward, crushed the barbed wire like it was spiderweb, and drove the nose of the Kangaroo right over the lip of the German trench. And then, the Trojan horse opened. The moment the first Canadian soldier vaulted over the side of the Kangaroo, the German understanding of warfare collapsed. In a traditional assault, the infantry arriving at an enemy trench were exhausted. They were men who had just sprinted, crawled, and scrambled through hundreds of yards of mud while being shot at. They were out of breath. Their hearts were hammering with terror, and their numbers had usually been thinned by the crossing. They were easy prey for a dug-in defender who had been waiting comfortably with a submachine gun. But the men pouring out of the belly of the Headless Tank were different. They were fresh. They hadn't run a single step. They hadn't dodged a single bullet. They were dry. Their heart rates were steady, and they were carrying the pent-up aggression of men who had spent the last 20 minutes sitting in a steel box, listening to bullets bounce off the hull. They hit the ground running, bayonets fixed, grenades in hand, right in the center of the German position. For the German defenders of the 89th Infantry Division, it was a scene of absolute horror. One moment, they were firing at a clumsy, blind vehicle. The next, they were swarmed by 30, 40, 50 angry Highlanders who seemed to materialize out of thin air. The killing zone, that carefully calculated distance between the wheat field and the trench, had been erased. The battle was no longer a long-range duel. It was a knife fight in a telephone booth. The panic was contagious. As the Kangaroos drove deeper into the German lines, bypassing the forward strong points and unloading their cargo in the rear areas, the German command structure disintegrated. The Headless Tanks didn't stop to fight the pillboxes. They simply drove over them or around them, delivering the infantry directly to the enemy headquarters and artillery batteries. The German officers, trying to radio their forward units, found that the Canadians were already kicking down the doors of their command bunkers. The laughter that had greeted the clumsy Canadian vehicles vanished. In its place was a new, creeping superstition. Prisoners captured that night asked their captors about the ghost tanks. They wanted to know what kind of secret weapon could drive through a wall of fire without slowing down. When they were told it was just an old artillery piece with the gun ripped out, they refused to believe it. It was too simple. It was too unmilitary. To the German mind, obsessed with over-engineered wonder weapons like the V-2 rocket or the Tiger II tank, the idea that a piece of scrap metal welded over a hole could defeat the Wehrmacht was insulting. But Simonds didn't care about insults. He cared about momentum. Operation Totalize was a smashing success, largely due to the Kangaroos. The Canadians broke through the German lines south of Caen, a feat that had eluded the Allies for weeks, and they did it with shockingly few casualties among the infantry, regiments that would historically have lost 50% of their strength. Attacking a position like Verrières Ridge took the objective with only a handful of wounded men. The Headless Tanks had done their job. The success was so undeniable that the Kangaroo went from being a weird, ad hoc experiment to an official unit almost overnight. The 1st Canadian Armoured Carrier Regiment was formed, the only unit of its kind in the entire Allied force. It was a regiment of taxi drivers for the apocalypse. They painted their vehicles with the squadron markings. They welded extra armor onto the sides, and they began to treat their defrocked priests with the same love and care a tanker gave his Sherman. The drivers of these vehicles developed a unique swagger. They weren't tank commanders, they couldn't shoot back, but they were the most popular men in the army. To the infantry, a Kangaroo driver was a guardian angel. He was the guy who would drive into the mouth of hell to pick you up. As the campaign moved out of Normandy and into the Channel ports, and eventually into Holland, the Kangaroos evolved. The infantry began to customize them. They welded Bren guns to the rails so they could provide suppression fire while moving. They piled sandbags on the front. They turned the headless tanks into mobile fortresses. There is a specific engagement later in the war, near the Dutch border, that perfectly illustrates the psychological dominance of this strange vehicle. A German paratrooper unit, the elite Fallschirmjäger, was holding a farmhouse at the end of a long, flat causeway. It was a perfect sniper's nest. Any infantry attempting to walk down that road would be picked off one by one. A standard tank attack was risky because the Germans had Panzerfaust's anti-tank rockets that could burn through a Sherman. The Canadians didn't send a tank, they sent a single Kangaroo. The German paratroopers watched the boxy, ugly shape rumbling down the road. They held their fire, waiting for it to get into range of their rockets. They assumed it was a supply truck or a lost recovery vehicle. It looked harmless. It had no turret. It had no cannon. It was just a metal box. The Kangaroo drove straight up to the front door of the farmhouse, absorbing small arms fire that pinged off its nose like hail. The driver slammed on the brakes. The Germans raised their Panzerfausts, ready to fire. But before they could pull the triggers, 20 Canadians stood up in the open troop compartment and unleashed a volley of Bren gun and rifle fire from 10 yards away. The farmhouse was shredded. The headless tank hadn't needed a cannon. It had brought 20 rifles to the front door. The Fallschirmjäger, the elite of the Luftwaffe, surrendered. They had been beaten by a bus. This was the genius of Guy Simonds. He understood that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield wasn't a 17-pounder gun or a high-explosive shell. It was the Canadian soldier. The problem wasn't the soldier's ability to fight. It was getting him to the fight alive. The Kangaroo solved the equation. The legacy of the headless tank goes far beyond the battlefields of World War II. Simonds had essentially invented the modern Armoured Personnel Carrier, APC. Every time you see a modern M113, a Bradley fighting vehicle, or a Stryker, you are looking at the great-grandchild of the Kangaroo. The concept of mechanized infantry, infantry that fights in concert with tanks, protected by their own armor, was born in the workshops of Normandy, sparked by a desperate need to stop walking into machine gun fire. But for the Germans in 1944, there was no appreciation for the historical innovation. There was only the terrifying reality of the zombies. That was another nickname they gave the Kangaroos in the later months. Zombies, because you couldn't kill them. You could shoot them, blow their tracks off, and set them on fire, but they would still keep coming, disgorging more and more men. By the time the Canadians reached the Rhine, the mockery was long gone. The German tankers who had laughed at the funny-looking vehicles in Normandy were now mostly dead or captured, their superior Tigers rusting in the French fields. The headless tanks had outlasted them. There is a poignant story from the liberation of the Netherlands that serves as a fitting epitaph for the Kangaroo. As the Canadian columns rolled into the liberated towns, the streets were lined with cheering Dutch civilians. The Sherman tanks, with their big guns, were impressive, but the loudest cheers often went to the dirty, battered Kangaroos. The civilians would run up to the open tops of the vehicles, handing up apples, cheese, and flowers to the soldiers riding inside. The soldiers would reach down, grab the gifts, and pull the children up for a ride. The vehicle that had been designed as a machine of war, a vehicle born from the necessity of slaughter, became a parade float of liberation. The headless tank that had terrified the SS was now carrying flower-wreathed infantrymen and laughing Dutch children. In the end, the German tankers were right about one thing. The Kangaroo looked ridiculous. It was ugly. It was an improvisation. It was a tank with its head cut off. But in war, stupid is only stupid if it doesn't work. If it works, it's brilliant. And the Kangaroo worked. It saved thousands of Canadian lives. It allowed fathers to go home to their children instead of being left in a wheat field in France. It proved that while the Germans might have had the best tanks, the best guns, and the best uniforms, the Canadians had something better. They had the ability to look at a pile of junk, see a way to win, and drive it straight down the throat of the enemy. The Headless Tanks never got the glory of the Spitfire or the Tiger. You rarely see them in movies. They aren't the stars of video games. But to the men of the 1st Canadian Army, that ugly, open-topped steel box was the most beautiful thing in the world. It was the difference between a telegram home and a ticket home, and that, in the final analysis, is the only victory that matters.